Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And the first of our several obnoxious trumpet pictures through the slide deck.
I hope there's more of those throughout the presentation. All right.
So why are we here today?
Well, we're going to be diving into a couple things, and you know, Shanna, working with our customers, I get asked about both these things all the time. You know, what's vulnerability scanning, penetration testing. What's the difference between the two of them? So we are going to get down to brass tacks. We're going to take a deep dive into both, go through some of the lingo, the types of vulnerability scanning, types of pen testing, explain the differences. And the goal at the end of today is that everyone will be an expert, hopefully.
Awesome. So some of the different types of testing that are available, and there can be some confusion about all of the different types of tests because it can get kind of complicated kind of quickly. We'll have a lot of companies or partners or just people reaching out to us. Even when I go to trade shows, it's one of the things I hear the most is, oh, can you do penetration testing? Can you replace XYZ vulnerability scanning product? And a lot of the times it's not just a very cut and dry answer when we're talking about different types of penetration tests. Usually this is a third party question that is being asked, or it's a requirement of some type of contract that you might have, or in order to do business with the government, let's say, or some compliance, whether it's state or industry specific. And there are a lot of different types of scanning and a lot of different types of penetration testing that are available. So just to kind of go high level here, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into all of these. Some of the different options for vulnerability scanning. For infrastructure, we have external network vulnerability scanning, which is included for free in our Essentials package if you haven't signed up, and check out our challenge. Shameless plug there. But the external scanning side of things, what we're doing is looking at the external perimeter, and we'll dive down a little bit more into that. We also do internal network scanning as well. So like kind of on the inside of the fence, if you think of it like that. And then there are also instances where we are doing web application vulnerability scanning. So that is usually one where a lot of our customers are like, oh, I didn't know you had the capability of doing that. So our vulnerability scanner is amazing. It can actually crawl web applications and look for known vulnerabilities. Not to be confused, and we had a big internal dialogue about the differences between vulnerability scanning versus vulnerability assessments, because they are different. A vulnerability scan is a much it's a much less involved. It's a scan that you kick off, you get a big long report back, and then you get to work fixing and prioritizing, remediating. A vulnerability assessment goes a lot further than that. So some examples of things that might be included in a vulnerability assessment are asset inventories, which I know is a big pain point for a lot of IT professionals. Just knowing what you have that you need to protect is half the battle with a lot of people that we're talking to. Another thing that can be included in an overall vulnerability assessment is a social engineering side, or like, human vulnerabilities, because we're all vulnerable. We might be trying to be just an amazing chivalrous person, and there's somebody carrying a huge package in the door behind us, and we hold the door open. We don't make them scan their access control badge. So there could be some physical security elements to an overall vulnerability assessment. There could be use of common tactics like phishing emails, spear phishing, or calling in pretending to be the company's attorney and needing some sensitive information over the phone, or vishing. And as if we don't have enough phishing words, it could be smishing and sending text message or SMS-based attacks to employees. I mentioned the tailgating side of things, and following people in through the door, could be impersonating an HVAC company and trying to gain access and uncover some vulnerabilities, or even dropping USB keys in your parking lot that say, XYZ company payroll, and seeing how many people pick those up and plug them into their devices. There could also be some identification of process vulnerabilities. So, as we know, cybersecurity is a combination of people, process, and technology. So an overall vulnerability assessment can incorporate all of those different components. And then there's also a side of the vulnerability assessments. Maybe you take a vulnerability scan as part of that vulnerability assessment and look at all of the list of potential exposures or risks, and then go through and begin prioritizing those for remediation, and then trying to go through and identify, based on your business processes, what you know about your organization, alleviating that topmost risk factor section from any component, whether it's a vulnerability scan of your technology pieces or the human side or the physical side, and then trying to reduce those risk factors and looking at what your high value assets are. Sorry, I'm putting my slippers back on because my feet are cold. It's Maine, it's cold. So there's a lot more to a vulnerability assessment than just kicking off a scan and getting a nice big long report back. On the penetration testing side of things, there are also a ton of different types of tests that we're going to talk about today. Similar to vulnerability scanning, there are external penetration tests, same thing, perimeter, public internet facing, internal. That's a great one because a lot of the cyber attacks, as you probably well know, are not the Dorito dusted teenager hacking away in his mom's basement in his hoodie. It's as a result of a spear phishing email, or they're able to get internal network access some way or another, so they're not having to breach the perimeter. They're getting invited right in the front door. We're sitting them down for a cup of coffee, we're handing over our credentials, whatever it might be. So they're not always starting from the outside, they're gaining local access and then trying to move from there. So a good test is to position from within inside, the castle gates and the moat, and then see what we can accomplish from there. Web application is another very popular penetration testing request that we're seeing, actually quite frequently. I think how many of them in the last month?
2 or 3. Yeah. It's a big request.
And then a lot of people didn't know that we actually have the capability of doing mobile application testing as well. So I think I've only had maybe 2 conversations about that, but a lot of people are making their own mobile apps. Actually, just one of the conferences I'm going to, they're like, download our mobile app, and I'm like, oh, okay. And then thankfully they're a very good customer of ours as well, so I think they're good. Another type of penetration test is a network segmentation test. So this one we see quite frequently for PCI compliance. So let's say you have a large, retail store. Those still exist now? I think a few of them do.
I don't know.
Or maybe, just any type of situation where you might have a payment processing system and you're subject to PCI compliance, and you have to make sure that the registers, maybe you've got some restaurants that you work for a restaurant chain or something like that, and you want to make sure that the network where you have your payment processing systems is segmented appropriately from your general corporate network or your guest network, which also leads me into wireless testing. So there are wireless pen tests that we can do where we're looking for rogue access points on the network. We're specifically in this test targeting an organization's wireless LAN. And we can also do things like Bluetooth, for example. And the goal here is to identify rogue access points, any types of weaknesses in encryption, WPA vulnerabilities, any type of like, man in the middle attacks that could be successful, or if they're able to, again, kind of going back to that network segmentation side of things, if you're able to jump, let's say, from the guest wireless network over to the corporate network. So that's kind of a high level overview of the different types of tests that are available. We're going to dive into a handful of these a little bit more.
All right. All right. So it looks like we have a lot of testing variables here, Shanna. And, I find a lot of times when talking to customers about this, there, can be a lot of confusion about what each one of these means. So, maybe kind of explain a little bit, what each of these variables is and why it's important.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, that when people say like, oh, I need a penetration test done, or looking for some vulnerability scans, a lot of the times either they or we have some follow-up questions of exactly what they're looking for that scope of work to be. Because obviously we want to make sure that we're helping you check the boxes that you need to check in order to meet your compliance requirements, or gain that really huge contract where you've already gotten the award, but you just have to prove your cybersecurity posture, or keep your large third-party enterprise client that's stuffing those cybersecurity questionnaires and everything else down on you. Or maybe it's even cyber insurance. If they start asking for this type of stuff, I wouldn't really be surprised based on the last couple months. So some of the different types of variables and kind of options that you can have within those types of testing obviously are internal or external testing. So for external testing, what we're doing is targeting that kind of like external facing infrastructure. So could be, your servers, applications, devices, firewalls, switches, routers, anything that would be directly accessible from the public internet. So kind of like, north-south testing. That is usually, that's the typical what you think of when you think of like, hacking attacks, is somebody trying to breach the perimeter and break in from the outside. Or the test can be internal. So in that situation, whether it's vulnerability scanning or penetration testing, what we're doing is looking at and going after assets on the inside of the perimeter that could be compromised if an employee clicked on a phishing email, or went to a watering hole website, or obtained malware through any number of different ways. Then, if that attacker lands on that internal asset, that, let's say it's a workstation, what can be accomplished from there, or what vulnerabilities exist on that device that could be exploited, or what ways could that attacker move laterally or east to west once that local network access has been established. So external and internal is a big, variable or differentiator. The next type of variable is authenticated or unauthenticated. So authenticated is when they are performing these types of tests with access. So like they are a trusted user. And in the case of authenticated, those types of scans and tests allow the tester to log in as a user, see those kinds of vulnerabilities from that trusted perspective, versus an authenticated, words are hard. Unauthenticated scan is where it is void of network access, kind of like what you think of how an attacker would likely be starting. So they might not necessarily have credentials or authorization. They may not be positioned inside the network, so they might not have that validation or perspective of an authorized user or authenticated user. So that unauthentic scan does the opposite and offers really more of a perspective of an intruder. So on the authenticated side, you can go kind of deeper into the asset, like see, from a workstation level operating system, your configurations, your patches. Unauthenticated, a lot of the times we're looking at it just from the outside, like what public information is available, what vulnerabilities might exist on those external facing systems or applications or infrastructure. Another variable is with some of these like scanning type tools, or even some penetration testing, is where kind of are we like sitting? Where are we starting? So a lot of scanning agents can be network based. So in those types of situations, we're utilizing common discovery protocols. We're pinging and then compiling like an inventory of devices that we find attached to or within that network. obviously the last couple of years, a lot of things have changed. So the flip side of that, with all of our roaming endpoints and work from home and the pandemic and the forced digital transformation has changed a lot of that, and many people have abandoned the traditional concept of a internal network. A lot of people aren't even bothering to VPN into the network anymore. Employees are just working from home. So in that case, some people might choose to do agent-based scans or tests where that's run locally on their device, whether that's a server, a laptop, a mobile phone, whatever it might be, and that device is just continuously reporting back, usually to some type of cloud platform, and it doesn't matter where that device is located, whether it's at home. You can make sure that all of those roaming and remote endpoints are patched and up to date, which can be a major challenge in this crazy post-pandemic work landscape. Another set of variables here is black box versus white box versus gray box, because that's what happens when we combine. Why couldn't it be like black, white, purple? Because black and white make gray. But so black box testing is no information is provided. So kind of like authenticated versus unauthenticated, is no information is provided. It follows the approach of an unprivileged attacker who's trying to gain that network access initially. So usually for the tester, there's a little bit of reconnaissance that has to be done, and some kind of discovery ahead of time. They're going in totally blind, and they're just trying. Sometimes it's completely blind, as you don't even have, let's say for an external network penetration test, they don't even have the IP addresses of the company's external network. So that is just totally in the dark, hence black. And then a white box test is performed where the testers know about either like the full network and system information. They may even have either like network maps or credentials, or they know the software or the internal makeup of whatever they're testing. So they've got a better kind of starting point as far as knowledge. And then gray is obviously kind of in between there, so it's limited knowledge. And in most real world attacks, the attackers do a lot of research ahead of time. They're spending, the time looking at the target environment. They're researching on social media. They're gathering as much information as they possibly can about your organization. So sometimes they have similar knowledge to an insider. So they've gone through and done their reconnaissance. So gray box testing a lot of the times is favored by customers because it gives, that balance between efficiency, because they don't have to do all of that reconnaissance ahead of time like they do in black box, versus authenticity compared to white box, where they're given a lot of the information, and you really want to simulate what a potential attack could look like. So gray box testing is pretty popular. Another question we get asked a lot about vulnerability scanning is the difference between active or passive. So active being that this scanning tool is sending a probe to each IP address on the network, and then just waiting for that response to see if any device is listening. That generally alerts to the presence of a scan. Also, I've heard horror stories. I'm sure, Glenn, you could probably speak to this as well, but a lot of the times that active scanning, I've seen customers that talk about, servers locking up because of those the active scanning probes, and it just kind of like shutting down and being like, no, can't scan me. Versus passive scanning is more information obtained from like network data captured without direct interaction with the targets. So those can get some information about like operating systems, protocols, ports, active applications, known CVEs. So we've seen passive scanning more popular than active. Just runs, collects the information, doesn't generally cause any issues down the road. And then other variables are full testing versus just a range. So in full, I know at least from the Defendify side of things, let's say it's a vulnerability scan. we might just let our scanning agent utilize auto discovery, pick up every network connected asset and scan it periodically over the course of a month, and then produce that report. So full is, every asset, every IP address, the full-fledged, versus just a range. So sometimes I've seen this where, like, for example, I worked with a company one time, and the only thing that they wanted done for internal vulnerability scanning was their 12 on-prem servers, and that was it. They didn't care as much about workstations or anything like that. They just wanted those servers scanned. So they can give us just a CIDR range, and we just scan that for them. So there's another testing variable. Sometimes based on compliance issues or budget or other factors, we might see an organization do like a range of the most high value assets on an ongoing or monthly basis, and then maybe for PCI compliance or some other reason, they might only do like a quarterly full scan. So it's another variable there. It's a lot of information.
Yeah, no, it's all good. All right, so what is vulnerability scanning? Oh, actually, jumping the gun here. I'll let you talk.
Yeah, so one of the biggest questions that we hear or end up having to do a little bit of education about is the difference between a vulnerability scan and a penetration test. They're similar, but they're a little bit different. So on the vulnerability scanning side, we're trying to identify potential vulnerabilities to an asset. There may even be a risk score that's given, but it doesn't necessarily show potential exploitation. So my little analogy here is like if I was doing a vulnerability scan for a building, it's kind of similar to like a security guard walking around the outside of your physical building. So they might be checking for things like, all the doors are closed and locked, all the windows are locked, that somebody can't rappel Mission Impossible style down through your HVAC system and get into your building. So that's more of like the vulnerability scan. It's just taking a look at what potential entry points or vulnerabilities exist. You might have a window on the 5th story of your building that's cracked a little bit. Is that a potential entry point for somebody? Sure, absolutely. Is it likely that they're going to Spider-Man up your building and get in through that window? Probably not. And then nothing kind of gives you an idea of what would happen if they did get through that 5th story window. That's the difference between vulnerability scanning and penetration testing. Penetration testing doesn't necessarily care or report about the 27 doors on the outside of your building, doors and windows that were locked and were totally secure. What we're looking at here, it's more like outcome based and determines the extent of that risk within the environment when that person does get up in and through that window. Where does that drop them? What type of sensitive information can they access? If somebody comes in through one of my unlocked windows or shimmies down my chimney like Santa, can they get to my jewelry box? Can they get to my spare checkbook in my filing cabinet? Like, what can they do once they get inside, and how bad could it be? So that kind of is the way that I explain the difference between them. And we'll jump into a little bit more when we go into each one in depth.
All right, so let's start with vulnerability scanning. So what is vulnerability scanning? Basically, a vulnerability scan is going to search and identify any common vulnerabilities and exposures, or CVEs, within a company's network, systems, workstation servers, applications. The goal is, obviously the outcome is to find any out-of-date software, hardware, and applications, IoT devices, so security cameras, printers, even coffee machines, that, still have default passwords, or, again, anything that's out of date. This is typically automated, and really the primary function is to search for anything that's a known unknown, I guess, if that makes sense. So things that are known to be vulnerabilities, but maybe you're not aware of them. That way you can fix them.
Absolutely. We had a customer the very first month that we got the vulnerability scanning up and activated. We found a relatively simple password that we were able to crack just with a dictionary attack. And it's something that our vulnerability scanner is capable of. that was a backdoor to their backups. So if anybody's seen anything about about ransomware lately, they know that the backups have been targeted like crazy, and it wasn't a crazy, it wasn't like admin or password or anything like extremely simple like that. Wouldn't be something you would have guessed just right off the top of your head, but it was still easy enough that our scanner was able to crack it. And they had one of those moments of like, oh my gosh, like just this alone is like worth its weight in gold for us. And that was just with a scan, never mind an actual manual infiltration attempt. So a couple key points here about vulnerability scans. So these are ongoing. So usually we recommend like at least monthly, but also other reasons why you might do a vulnerability scan, like an ad hoc scan would be the introduction of new devices, new or changing infrastructure. You'll want to make sure that you run a vulnerability scan, or if something comes out and you want to know if it affects you or not. The report that's going to be generated is usually very long, unless you have an incredibly amazing security team, but it's more list oriented. So it's just, this is a known vulnerability, this is a known vulnerability. Hopefully the list that you get produced back is ranked by the most critical vulnerabilities first. And if you're lucky, your vulnerability scanner may give you some generic remediation advice, which of course, it's general advice, not to be overshadowed by your own knowledge of your network. I know, can't just immediately go right in and apply all of the patches and just hope that, you know what breaks loose and everything doesn't crash. And that, so oftentimes, you have these remediations that may range from very simple, just apply the patch that's been released, versus some complex workarounds or configurations in order to remediate that vulnerability. So CVEs, we mentioned that. What is a CVE? Glenn said the what was it? Known unknowns?
Known unknowns. Yeah.
Yes, known unknowns. So the known unknowns, there is a big, large system, the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposure System, CVEs, is a large publicly facing database operated by MITRE that maintains all of the known vulnerabilities that currently exist out there. This is one of my favorite databases to go to when people are like, oh, Macs can't get hacked. So I love to show them all of the CVEs of their iPhone, whatever, or their MacBook. So this is very important. The database is updated anytime that there is a known vulnerability. It's given a name and a number. So it might be CVE 2022-222. Couldn't help it. So it's disclosed publicly, usually disclosed to the manufacturer of the software or the application, or whatever it might be. So that vulnerability has been disclosed and usually updated in the database, and that security or that vendor is trying to release a patch or an update that addresses it. We also have 0-day vulnerabilities. So those are flaws or weaknesses or bugs that may have been publicly disclosed, but then remain unpatched. So the vendor or developer is aware of the issue, but they just haven't been able to release that patch yet. So the term comes from 0 days since the vendor or developer, and then of course, like resulting, the users or organizations who are affected by that vulnerability have just learned of it. So it's become public and it's been out for 0 days. So at that point, it kind of becomes a race between the vendors or the developers who are trying to issue the patch. Once it's if they've already deployed the patch, it then becomes an end-day vulnerability. But in that time in between when it's disclosed and that patch is released, that is where it's kind of a race between the vendors trying to release that patch and the bad guys trying to exploit it. So that's one of the reasons why it's extremely important to do this ongoing scanning, because you don't want to find out 9 months from now that you still have a Microsoft Exchange vulnerability. I'm sorry, I swear I'm not calling you out. No, just kidding. You know who you are. And then with the vulnerability scan report, what we do is report back on the vulnerability ranking system. So our vulnerability scanner generally follows the CVSS scoring methodology, which talks about just basically like, how bad could this be? How likely is it that it's going to be exploited? How easy is it to exploit? What types of systems could it affect? But one of the things I love about our vulnerability scanner is it definitely takes into account the CVSS score, but the more times it's scanning in your environment, the more it's learning about it. So we may prioritize differently based on our knowledge of your infrastructure, or what our scanner has uncovered time after time in your scans, compared to just the general CVSS scoring methodology. But either way, it gives you a good ranking system in order to start remediating those vulnerabilities. Obviously, the most important ones are the critical vulnerabilities. These are the ones that we want to try to tackle first, and then working our way down through the mediums. And then there's also warning and info, which would need a little bit more input from you and a little bit of analysis as to whether or not that is potentially something that could affect you or would warrant further investigation or remediation. And then info is just kind of like an FYI. So starting with those criticals and then moving down through the mediums.
Yeah, and this, Shanna, just to interject, this comes up a lot. I think when someone gets this long vulnerability scan report, it's overwhelming. You have criticals, mediums, warnings, and it's like, where do I even start? And so my guidance is always, if you do anything with this, focus on those criticals first, make sure you address those, and then start working down through the mediums, kind of determining which ones you can get rid of most easily, and just slowly chip away at that list. But if you do anything with that report, make sure that you address those criticals, because those are always going to pose the highest risk.
Absolutely. I could not agree more with you on that. Holy crap, I just got a ton of just little notifications popping up here. So totally agree. I talk to a lot of people. It's very interesting how the IT professionals that we're working with on a regular basis, some people just prefer to look at something asset by asset. Like, I want to start with this asset, I want to remediate all the vulnerabilities that are known here, and then kind of move that way, which I understand. But if you let that window lapse, especially with a 0-day that has just come out, it's just been named, the developer's working on a patch or an update, the more time that passes, the more risk there is with those critical vulnerabilities. So the ranking system does give you an idea of where to start. I think it would make sense if you go through and remediate as many of those critical vulnerabilities as you possibly can without obviously affecting other systems. And then you're looking for a way to start tackling some of the mediums and going through those. At that point, asset by asset, it makes some sense, but definitely start with the criticals, because those have been identified in multiple ways of being the highest risk to the org. And sometimes there's just nothing you can do about it. So here is an example of a vulnerability scan. And so you can see some of the examples of some of the vulnerabilities that are uncovered. So out of date Apache, always, am I right? Default passwords. We see a lot of SSL, TLS, a lot of those types of vulnerabilities. End of life, workstations, servers, all kinds of crazy things. RDP, it's another very popular one there. We've seen, oh goodness, Blue Keep and Heartbleed, and let's see, what else? Yeah, tons of different ones. This is just a sampling of one of our customers.
All right, so trigger warning here.
Sorry to anybody who had their holidays ruined dealing with this one, but
Yeah.
a few people are probably cringing right now. Sorry. So this was an example of a vulnerability scan with log4j or log4j, depending on who you ask, log4 shell. So this is definitely something that is popping up over and over and over again, and we'll have another one that will pop up. So something that we can scan for.
All right, so that brings us to penetration testing. So what is that? Yeah, it goes by a couple names: pen test, penetration testing, ethical hacking. And it actually involves attempting to exploit weaknesses in your network to gain access to all the sensitive data in your systems. We have a professional that's conducting this manual test, can simulate a variety of threats out there. And really the goal there is to demonstrate how easily the system or network can be, accessed, and, the impacts that it might have. The type of testing is outcome based. Basically determine whether or not a vulnerability is exploitable, the potential damage that could arise from that, and what you can do to prevent an actual hacker from having access to those same things.
Absolutely. Did you see the this cracks me up. 1 out of 5 cats are actually computer hackers.
Your animations are on point today.
I would believe that. So some of the goals here of penetration testing. So here we are looking for actually exploitable vulnerabilities. So, 47th story window, not super worried about that. It is goal oriented. So instead of just producing a report back that is a big giant long list of all potential vulnerabilities, it is outcome based. So our goal is to gain access to this system, see what kind of data we're able to exfiltrate, and try to go after that. So the goals here are to gain access, escalate privileges, cause some damage, just like the attackers would do. See what type of data or intellectual property that we are able to uncover based on that test. If we're doing an internal test and starting within the network, can we move around laterally? Can we get to the crown jewels? And one of the things about a penetration test is it's just a snapshot. So it's a snapshot of during this particular time, we were everything was secure in this moment, but it's not necessarily that it's going to be that way forever. Most organizations conduct penetration testing or ethical hacking. We prefer ethical hacking. We think it's kind of a nicer way of saying what it is. Usually they do it about once per year. Some organizations may run these tests more frequently. If they have major infrastructure changes, then they might conduct a penetration test. And one of the big differences here is in the reports. I think, Glenn, you had a customer one time who had tell us about the vulnerability scan pen test.
Oh, right. So, with a customer we were talking with, he's like, oh, I already do penetration testing or ethical hacking. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. He's like, yeah, I have the report. So we asked him to pull it up. And so he showed us this report, and it looked strikingly similar to our vulnerability scan report. And, basically listed those CVEs and, everything you'd find on a vulnerability scan. And I see this come up occasionally where they've kind of given it the name of like a automated pen test. Obviously, automation can only go so far, as we kind of discussed in Shanna's analogy with the buildings, and an automated pen test isn't going to try and get through that window or scale the building and try and get to the crown jewels. It's, again, just going to show you those vulnerabilities. So I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of times there's confusion around the difference between penetration testing and vulnerability scanning, because there are pieces or tools out there that are saying it's a penetration test when in fact it's just a glorified vulnerability scan.
I remember that discussion, because we said, when we're talking about like, oh, you've had a penetration test, awesome. What did it uncover? Like, what was the outcome? And it was like, oh yeah, I got a whole long list. And we were like, red flag. Should not be a long list.
Right.
So as you can see here, this is an example of just a table of contents of a penetration testing report. Again, we don't care about the 27 doors and windows that were locked. We're looking at the few that were unlocked and the potential risks that are associated with that. Like, what if an attacker was able to get in, where could they go? What could they do? And a big portion of that is the manual component of it. All of our penetration testers are certified white hat ethical hackers, but they also have specialties beyond that. So let's say they're doing an external network penetration test. They might also have, like a boatload of networking, credentials or certifications. And then if they are, a web application penetration tester, then they have extensive knowledge in that as well. The attackers are not just using automated tools in order to infiltrate initially or gain access or escalate privileges or move laterally. There's a component of decision making. Could you go into a scanner and program some logic, like if this, then this? Yes, probably. But the looking at different, like as you're learning as you're going, making decisions, learning the newest tactics that the attackers are using, that is all stuff that is just much better done by an actual human being and real time, and making sure that they're getting creative and thinking outside of the box and trying other types of things. Maybe they're, on your CEO's personal Facebook page and finding out that, he's a huge Yankees fan, and, maybe trying some password combinations of, the Yankees and his birthday or kids' names or things like that. Those are tactics that the actual attackers are using. So we want the penetration test to emulate a real attack as much as possible. So some of the things that should be included in your penetration testing report, and also red flags that you really just paid for a vulnerability scan, is, then this is an example of a Defendify report, but universal going to any other type of service. So for example, we talk about, how to use this report. The tester might put some guidance in there for anything like weird or that, maybe the reader might not necessarily understand. And then into the executive summary. This is awesome because it gives a high level, not too technical overview. Like, here are the good things, here are the bad things, these are the things that were a problem. It's not too technical. For example, like in that, it might say a database attack versus SQL. So that if you're giving this to an executive reader or a decision maker or the checkbook signer, it gives them an idea of the basic techniques that were used, what was uncovered, and how bad it could be if it's not fixed. So that executive summary is a really good tool for people who have to explain very complicated technical things to non-technical business leaders. And then the scope of the service outlines, like, what the limits are. So what we could attack, what we couldn't, if there were any restrictions that were placed by the client. Sometimes we hear people say, I only want this penetration testing to be conducted on the weekend, or between the hours of 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. So that gives kind of the scope of the services. And then the overview, which is the methodologies, how we tested, what testing framework we followed, and that may vary depending on the type of test that we're conducting. So whether it's network or web application or mobile application or network segmentation, wireless, all those different options. And then it goes into the findings themselves. So we'll give you some examples here. So primary findings are going to detail what the penetration tester did. So the IPs that we tested against, and we provide some details. This one, for example, we put, because we didn't want to provide too much information, so we just put some unknowns in there for this is all mock data anyway, but we put like unknown in the host name and DNS. But if we had information, that just gives you the warm and fuzzies that, we went into this kind of like, on the darker shade of gray, uncovered all of this information about whatever services were at that IP address, and then any details to give you the warm and fuzzies to know that we did attack that IP address, and we did test it. We gathered as much information as we possibly could about it. And then just some notes about anything that we uncovered during that first part of the testing. Anything that is actually uncovered. So the details, for example, we've got some default passwords here. We've got a few examples in the bottom, remote desktop, different details. Again, just to give you the warm and fuzzies, screenshots as well along the way, because one of our goals by the end of this report, when we're going through all the overviews of the findings, we want you to be able to recreate any of the findings that we found. So testing tools will be listed out if they use Nmap or Burp Suite or any other type of tools. Those will all be listed, and that way, you know how we got there. There's detailed screenshots going all the way down, and then you can recreate it, see it for yourself, and then go in and remediate. So a couple other examples of some of the types of things that we've uncovered in the tests. God, wasn't there a camera one too at one point?
Yeah, I think there was a camera one. That was a while back, I believe, but we basically were able to determine, and again, just to your point of having a real person actually using their knowledge to exploit these vulnerabilities, was able to see the make and model of the camera, did a Google search for the default password, put that password in, and sure enough, gave that pen tester access to that camera. We were able to take screenshots right from that surveillance camera. So. And it just shows the importance. I mean, there's always the human element when we're setting things up within our network. Maybe it's Friday, you're setting up that camera, it's 4 o'clock, you need to run to the bank. I'll do this on Monday. I'll reset that password. Monday rolls around, Stephen, accountants, having trouble with the printer. So you start fixing, you get involved in these other projects and you forget all about that camera and still has that default password. So,
or sometimes
again,
the manufacturers, it's not even on us as the professionals. It's that the manufacturer doesn't even allow that. I work a lot with physical security integrators, and they're usually the ones that are installing these systems. And there was a lot of frustration for a long time about restrictions placed by the actual vendors themselves, and hands tied and having to go to other solutions because it just wasn't even an option to be able to change that default password. So. Some examples of other types of critical or high findings that we found, like SSH servers with root and passwords, or like an SSH vulnerability that allowed some form of remote code execution. One of the things about penetration testing is that any finding that would allow us to immediately achieve our goal in that penetration test, because again, it's goal oriented. We are after the crown jewels. So if we are able to break into that network and immediately gain access to those sensitive systems or critical data, then that is an immediate report that is generated, so that the client gets alerted immediately. That way they know about it before, other than us in that test, nobody else can exploit it. So that is a lot of our actual physical reports usually have some risk ratings that are mediums, some highs, but if it's just a really extremely high one, we'll put it in a report, but we're just immediately skipping right to notifying the client, so that they know that whoa, the whole side of your building is blown out, and anybody can just come and go as they please. So RDP through the firewall is also a high critical vulnerability. That's not necessarily one that we're always going to report immediately, but definitely shouldn't be something that's public. And then the risk rating overview that we use is the Microsoft Dread score. So we have damage potential, so how much damage could be caused by this, reproducibility, so how difficult is it to do this, exploitability, so what is needed in order to exploit this, how many users could this potentially affect, and how easy is it to discover this threat. So Dread threat modeling algorithm, and then at the bottom you'll get a Dread score for any of those types of findings. So give you an example here of some low, mediums, and highs. And then our last type of testing is web application penetration testing. So this is definitely a very popular topic now. Some of the scopes that are involved in web application penetration testing, this predominantly is gray box. So this is one of the ones that it takes a little bit more information to really understand the scope of the work. So a lot of different variables going on in here, unauthenticated versus authenticated. So if there are different roles or privilege levels that you want us to test in the authenticated testing, if you have like a permission matrix and are willing to provide that, how many pages, how many parameters, like how complex is this test that you want us to perform? If there is PCI compliance requirements, if there are any APIs. So there's a lot of different variables that go into this testing side of things. So some of the purposes for the web application penetration testing is we're looking to see whether the application itself has vulnerabilities that can lead to the server that the application sits on being compromised. We're looking for like OS command injections that could be successful. Like, can we own the server that website sits on? We also do testing in order to protect the user. So cross-site scripting attacks, these types of tests really like, we're trying to make sure that the actual application or the site is not exposing the users to unnecessary risks. So in this case, it could be non-credentialed. You just tell us the URL. We're trying to get past the authentication method, gain access, and see, if we can use that as that jumping off point to, bounce off the website server. They get real fancy and create a lot of different scripts. Or the test could be credentialed. So you're functioning within that application as an authenticated user. What risks exist inside the application? So, can I compromise your app? Can I gain access to your database and download sensitive information? Can I gain control of your application or your server? So a lot of different testing types there and a lot of different types of results that we get back. So there's a bunch of different options there as far as like the different types of categories that we're testing. So logic and flow, session management, injection vulnerabilities. So here is another example of the kind of what the report would look like in the table of contents. In this one, the report looks a little bit different because for each result that we find, there is like the testing result, and then there's a specific remediation for it. So the table of contents looks a little bit different. You'll see like 4.1 here and then 5.1 for HTML injection. So set up just slightly differently, but very same. So we've got some examples here from the web application side of things, some examples, the summary of the findings and the severity, same type of ranking system. And then, the recommendations for remediation are a little bit more generic. We don't know, what code we're not going to give you specific, like go in and change these 2 words in the code to XYZ. I guess actually that would be 3. So if we don't know like what you're coding in, we're not going to give you specific recommendations, but it's going to be a little bit more generic and some references to how you can go learn more about that.
Wow, so this is a lot of information, Shanna. I think, when I talk to customers, one of the, when they come to me and they're like, hey, I think we want to do a penetration test, one of the, first questions I ask is, well, what kind of pen test should I do? And, there are a lot of different variables. So how do you know, and for vulnerability scanning as well, internal, external, all of that, how do you know what's the right option for you? Like, what guidance would you offer? Just call Glenn. Right?
Just call Glenn. Better call Saul. Better call Glenn. Well, I mean, I've talked to some organizations that I remember saying to one of them, because they were talking about just how much of a mess they had on their hands, and then they were talking to me about doing a penetration test, and I was like, at this point, you trying to do a penetration test is like worrying about what your lawn looks like when your house is on fire. Like, whoa, we're totally putting the cart before the horse here. But a couple of, this is like kind of a little comparison slide between the 2 options. So for vulnerability scanning, the frequency is, ongoing or ad hoc as needed anytime there are some major changes. I understand sometimes budget is a limiting factor, and some people, for compliance reasons, like they're only required to do a quarterly vulnerability scan. But I get that struggle, but also it's kind of like me going to the gym. Like if I'm always like trying to get like like summer bod back after having binged all winter and hibernated and done nothing, I'm always fighting an uphill battle. And it's the same thing with keeping up on vulnerabilities. You don't want, a 1,200-page vulnerability scanning report twice a year that you have to try to go through and remediate. It's easier if you just stay on top of it month after month and just work out a plan to go through those. Penetration testing, because again, it's just that once in time snapshot. Usually that is like once per year or after any major changes, or let's say, you're launching a new app, you want to make sure it's safe for your organization as well as for your customers. You might conduct a penetration test before going live. Differences in the report: vulnerability scanning, again, long list of all potential vulnerabilities, versus penetration testing is shorter. These are the outcomes. These are the systems that were able to be compromised, the associated risk, and only the successful attacks instead of all of the potential. The process behind each of the options: vulnerability scans are generally automated. They could be conducted with a combination of a software tool and performed by your internal IT staff if you have them, versus the penetration testing. It does have some scanning components, but it's more of a manual infiltration. And generally, just like a CFO doesn't audit their own books, usually the penetration testing has to be conducted by an independent third party. So the person who is setting up and managing the network isn't going to be the person who is testing it. Cost comparison between the two of them: penetration testing is more costly than just regular ongoing vulnerability scanning, because there is a lot more involved in the actual manual infiltration. But if you've had a mild heart attack over receiving a penetration test quote before, it probably doesn't have to be that bad. So again, call Glenn. The value of the two different options: the vulnerability scanning is a quick, high-level look at all of the potential vulnerabilities, separating out like the worst ones first, versus the value of penetration testing is, the actual successful compromise. So like running a fire drill of an attack and seeing how bad it could potentially be before the bad guys are the one running the fire drill or burning the place down. They've known to be arsonists. The time to complete for vulnerability scans are hours to days, versus penetration testing is usually days to weeks, depending on how many IP addresses that you're testing. Actually, I have expense on there twice. And then another thing to consider as well is which service is right for you. Do we have any compliance requirements here? So if you have, PCI requirement or FISMA or HIPAA, or, you're a DoD contractor who's breathing a little bit easier about CMMC, but still know that those are things that we should have been doing, but it's a whole story for another day or another webinar. If you fall in one of those buckets, you might have requirements for both, or you might have a certain cadence that you need to complete them, as well as state and local requirements as well.
Right. So that's super helpful. So really, when it boils down to it, we should be doing a combination of both. Those ongoing monthly vulnerability scans so that you can keep up on those things that could potentially be exploitable, and then annually doing that penetration test just to make sure nothing was missed, and kind of take that process every year.
Yes.
I love this.
I literally found every single GIF or GIF, depending on who you're asking, trumpet one that I could that entertained me, and also threw a 2 for Tuesday in there, because why not? It's Tuesday.
I hadn't looked at this slide, so mid-sentence it totally took me out of my frame of thought.
Well, thank you, everybody, and we will be making the recording available, so go ahead and head to defendify.com if you want to share it with somebody else. You might get some value out of this, and until next time, stay safe out there.
See you, everyone.
Bye.